Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Rolka. Thank you for checking out my video. This is questions from comments 41, where you submit your questions and I do my best to answer them. We've got a lot of cool questions today, talking a little bit about agility, about performance anxiety. So thank you if you've chosen to subscribe. If you haven't yet, I hope that you'll do so now. There are many other ways you can support my channel. Those are all in the description. They do include Patreon, where you can get MP3s and PDFs of these practices here on YouTube so that you can take them wherever your travels may take you, so that you can always vocalize before the gig. Number one, often with that kind of exercise, most of the teachers accelerate with the phrase going on and higher range, and it kind of frustrates me because what I do think I need is the tempo decreasing to try to have a better feeling of the muscles I use and how I use them in order to achieve a better higher range sound. I may be right or wrong, but what is your take on this? So that question was left on a video that was about agility, and I believe it was either in the zona de passaggio, like the area right by the secondo passaggio, right by the break, and then ascending over that point into the cricothyroid dominant singing voice, which is also called the head voice. And the reason why many voice teachers, myself included, go quickly through these areas is to try to make it so that you don't tighten up the muscles. When we are in those ranges of our voice, any amount of conscious control of the vocal mechanism almost always results in intonation problems, vocal tension. Most of the time, frequently, especially when you're early on in the practice, not allowing the cricothyroid muscles to elongate the vocal fold, hence giving you that cleaner upper register tone that's consistent with the voice below it. So by way of example, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I'm working on this aspect of my voice. Now, as a newer practitioner of this, I'm going to have you go as quickly as we can through these exercises because I want you to keep going and I don't want you to get tense. So where we might be here, and again, secondo passaggio for me is right about here. It's easier, believe it or not, to go that quickly instead of going slowly and trying to consciously change these muscle groups. Now you have to work your way up to exercises like that. Like that's not an intermediate, well, it's kind of like borderline intermediate advanced for practicing around the secondo passaggio, practicing around the break. You have to start with exercises that you are consciously controlling things, but in a very deliberate way that you and your teacher can agree and understand is the difference between cricothyroid dominant singing and thyroarytenoid dominant singing. Those exercises sound more like this. You, 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 you. And you can hear that first note of the exercise is clearly my cricothyroid dominant singing voice. You, 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 you. And then the tone quality changes. Believe it or not, having learned how to consciously be in that range and then moving more quickly so you're not using the muscles quite so deliberately with quite so much control is in fact the easiest and fastest way to have consistency over the secondo passaggio. What you're ultimately learning to do is to keep the vocal folds adducted, and especially if you've gotten into the habit of separating them, or if you've gotten into the habit of belting out notes that are in excess of the secondo passaggio over the break, and you haven't gotten into a registration event practice, then starting with that and then transferring into these faster paced exercises where you have to go in and out quickly even if it is a little bit sloppy, even if it is a little bit vague intonation-wise at first, is the better path to having a free and released vocal mechanism above the secondo passaggio. Because if you try to go slowly, too frequently what ends up happening is that you try to control it too much, and the tone qualities never really get to match. So you get a feel first of being in the cricothyroid dominant singing voice and then being out of it and learning to do that. Then you speed things up and you challenge yourself to move in and out of it fluidly, even at tonal changes and things like that. And you slowly refine the process. As you go further and further into that process, then you can actually start to slow things down and try to, quote unquote, sustain or hold these notes, which is really quite challenging because you have to continue to stay engaged, and that sense of engagement tends to increase over time, and that is necessary in order to keep the vocal fold fluid and released. Otherwise, we tend to clamp down, and then all the other problems start to come back. We get intonation problems, we get registration event problems, we could get stuck above the secondo passaggio and not really want to transition out of the cricothyroid dominant singing voice. All sorts of things unfold out of that inflexibility that is very easy to have happen. I hope that helps. Great question. Oops. There we go. As a relative beginner, I have been using your method for vowel alignment, agility, etc., but I sing in a choir mostly and am now realizing and curious about the dynamics of a piece. I am realizing the challenge of singing with dynamics and feel it's tricky to manage balance while singing piano to forte and all in between, especially when it happens in the same line. I wonder what practice might be useful to recognize and enjoy this skill in a more fluent way, so it doesn't sound too light or too pushed. I would incorporate dynamic practice into your vocalizations on a daily basis. So hopefully you have a daily vocalization practice, which is to say, if you're doing my videos on a daily basis, you have a daily vocalization practice. And when you're doing them, listen for the ascending versus descending lines, make a small little crescendo on the ascending, and then remove that crescendo. Make a diminuendo as you descend. In the lower parts of your range, it doesn't have to be a huge crescendo, nor a huge diminuendo. All of these crescendos and diminuendos, I would advise you to keep within the context of the viability of your sound. In other words, it should be consistent, it should be in tune. The tone qualities in vowel changes should match. All good singing practices, with the addition of a little bit of lift so that you increase the subglottic air pressure, you increase your support. You will additionally put a little bit more air over the vocal fold, and you can make that little crescendo, and you can bring that back by controlling the flow of air but maintaining your engagement. I would also suggest to you that dynamics are relative. You as a vocalist will not have the same kind of dynamic contrast that, for example, an oboe has. An oboe has much less dynamic contrast than you do. Equally, on any instrument that has a dedicated volume knob and a variety of different settings, that instrument may be capable of a vastly wider array of dynamics than we as humans with physical limitations due to the structures of our systems here would ever be able to attain. I can assure you that an electric guitar can play quite thunderously loud when plugged into a Marshall amp. We're not ever going to really make that volume of sound. It is truly thunderous. like kind of foundation of house shaking thunderous, right? So it's all relative, and it is all relative to you as well. What is piano for you will not be piano for someone else. We can always aspire to greater and greater control, but keep in mind it's all relative. And consider carefully how your choir director, your choral director, is asking you for dynamic changes in the song. It is, of course, hopefully you're part of a section, so hopefully there are several people involved, and your section leader should have some guidance as to how they want all of you to deal with these dynamics. That can sometimes mean asking a few people to stop singing for just a bar or two if it really requires that level of piano or pianissimo. Anyway, I hope that helps. Great question. Dynamics, I'm fond of saying dynamics never go out of style. They are a great aspect of our artistry and of our expressivity, and I applaud you for asking your question and looking at your dynamics very carefully and with some deliberate thought there. Well done. I keep on pushing the wrong buttons today. I'm trying to increase my range. 55 years old, feels like my voice is getting lower all the time. Would like to keep my range. Without knowing the specifics of what's happening with your voice, a daily vocalization practice is absolutely critical so that you keep the musculature toned and working and all that kind of stuff. If you haven't ever explored registration event practices, I would advise you to investigate it and see if that's something that you can get started with. There are lots and lots of resources. There are lots of resources here on my channel that talk about registration event practices. I would also mention that there's High Note Bootcamp if you're talking about upper register practice on my website. And yeah, I mean, amongst other things, I'm sure that there are lots of other resources out there, but those are just a few that immediately come to mind. But daily vocal practice, registration event practice, if you haven't worked on apagio breath management, that too would enhance the ease with which you would be able to apply those registration event practices, I might also add. I sang for like 3 hours with my band last night. Any tips on vocal recovery? I try really hard to keep vocals relaxed, but every once in a while I add a little extra and things tighten up. That's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. It would be great to know more about what the context of the band was, like what kind of music is it, and what is the monitoring situation. First and foremost, I would look there, and I would also look at how you're using your voice, and I would ask you why, not necessarily why you're tightening up. We might look at the root causes of that, because adding a little extra doesn't mean you have to get tight, but it could be that instead of looking at the color of your voice and the sort of forward or back resonances of it, instead of looking at the subglottic air pressure, how you're using airflow to increase or decrease those color changes or volume in your voice, you're doing other things. That may be leading you to this vocal fold engagement and tightness. And you haven't exactly said that there were any deleterious effects in your recovery. You haven't said if you got hoarse, or if you had like loads and loads of mucus where normally it's not so bad in the next morning, or anything like that. Like, there's only a small amount of information here to go on, but I would suggest that you first look at how you're using your voice. Is there or are there bits of low-hanging fruit that you can immediately look to? In other words, projection is often thought of as volume. They get used synonymously. And yet, that's not exactly right. I mean, volume is an aspect of it, sure, but resonance in the human voice has a lot more to do with how we project than just raw volume. The singer's formant is how it is usually referred to. And this is that coloration, that resonance. Engineers would think of it as a band of EQ that is present in all of our voices when we wish to project. We can cultivate more of it by doing like the NG exercise. So if you say hung, you get that NG. And there I have quite a lot of it in my voice. And that's going to create more projection for me. If I take it out, the volume here in the room is about the same, and yet there's quite a difference in the sound quality of my voice. When I don't have that projection, I will tend not to sound quite as forward or out there as when I add it back in. And we can learn to adjust that. And that's one of the exercises that I think is really, really useful for that. It's covered quite frequently on the channel. If you want me to do a specific video on it, I'm happy to. Just leave a comment below and I'll do that in the coming weeks. I'm female and honestly don't know what voice type I have. The sound is more soprano, but I don't reach those notes. I warm up with Jeff's tenor exercises because they are comfortable notes to sing. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, you're very welcome. I would keep vocalizing. If I were your teacher, I would maybe talk a little bit about this, get some ideas. You know, you have the idea that you are perhaps more soprano-like, but you like these tenor exercises. Now, the tenor exercises are almost mapped directly onto the alto, which that's also like a contralto range. Not everyone's gonna be the same though. So like altos, contraltos can frequently go quite low. They can cover nearly all the same range that a tenor vocalist can. If they develop their upper register, they can have quite a prodigious upper register. But tenor and alto map almost directly onto the piano. That doesn't mean you're an alto. And if you say the sound is more soprano-like, that could be an affectation. So the thing to do is to continue to work on vowel alignment, work on your registration event practice, work on your arpeggio breath management. All of these things are here on the channel. And over time, as you work on the vowel alignment, as you pursue registration event practice so that you're getting smooth transitions across the primo passaggio and across the middle voice registration event and across the secondo passaggio ultimately, the locations of those points will reveal to you your FOC, your vocal range designation, or your voice type. What you have is not as important as learning to use what you have. And those two things are frequently turned the other way around, where we try to assign ourselves to a FOC. In other words, I think I am a fill in the blank, baritone, tenor, lyric tenor, leggero tenor, like all that stuff. Like, we want to assign ourselves these FOCs and then start to work towards those ends. That doesn't always work out very well. And frequently, when we have a disposition towards one FOC over another, we can try to force ourselves to adhere to those like requirements. The better practice is to vocalize with intent, listen carefully during your vocalizations, work on the practices that I've mentioned, and as you continue to progress and as your vowels come into alignment and as you can sing across the various registration events in your voice with fluidity, you will then understand what your FOC is. It will reveal itself to you. I can get over the secondo passaggio, but I really strain very hard and my teacher doesn't know how to solve it. I can go over F, F sharp, I believe I'm a tenor, but I can't sing the notes properly because I strain. I didn't purposely put these in this order, but that's like a really good example of what I'm talking about. Coming to a conclusion where this vocalist doesn't sound like they're making a good registration event. I'm a tenor, and that means that I have a variety of registration events in my voice, just like any other tenor. My primo passaggio is roughly here, my secondo passaggio is roughly here. If I try to sing higher than these notes here, without making a registration event, without doing the transition into my cricothyroid dominant singing voice, then I will quite likely sound very similar to the way that the person who was asking this question is sounding. It would sound strained. I would not be able to really sing them properly or sustain them with any real effectiveness. It would sound hard and not very pleasant, mostly. The answer to your question is to learn to do the registration event. There's a 3-video series that I did here on the channel, How to Sing High Notes, parts 1, 2, and 3. Start with number 1. It takes you through the practice of learning to make a deliberate registration event. And this practice begins very deliberately. You, 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 you. The first note is one thing, the remaining arpeggio is something entirely different. You, 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 you. And the exercises will kind of go from there until when you get to part 3, and that might be too fast for some. That's what High Note Boot Camp is for, the course on my website. But it takes you through the steps to hopefully understand what's happening at the registration event. It's an elongation of the vocal folds where they remain adducted or closed. And some of the exercises that you can use to practice that registration event until you can do it fluidly. So again, if my secondo passaggio is here, and I sing, I'm making a registration event here. I am changing from my thyroarytenoid dominant singing voice, my chest voice, to my cricothyroid dominant singing voice, my head voice. And then I'm going back to my thyroarytenoid dominant singing voice, my chest voice, when I go back down. With practice, we can learn to do this, and that will make all those notes at F, F sharp, and above much, much nicer. At the very least, it will create more choice for you so that you can choose when you might want to belt from time to time versus when you want to do the registration event and have those notes be like that, which to the casual listener should be indistinguishable, except they would perceive it as being like a change in intensity. Like you're not kind of entering the call of the voice, you're singing it more melodically. It would be in tune, it would still have the same kind of resonances and color as the lower parts of your range. My question is, I have a lot of mucus in my throat at times, which I think contributes to the issue. Do you have any recommendations for this problem? Unfortunately, the issue wasn't left in the question, so I don't exactly know what your issue is. But if you have a lot of mucus, daily vocalization practice to kind of get things moving and move them off the vocal fold. If you have a lot of mucus or you have a really critical performance coming up, you might have to start your warm-up much earlier. Staying well hydrated, paying close attention to the foods that you eat. I love hot sauce. I love a good dab of sriracha on just about anything, but I can't eat as much of it. I can't really eat any of it any longer because I noticed it was starting to affect my voice in an unfavorable way. So, principally, it was creating a reaction where I was creating more mucus, and it was harder for me to warm up, harder for me to do all the things that I do on a daily basis with my singing. So, look at the foods that you're eating, stay well hydrated, consider carefully what you drink and when you're drinking it. So like if you have like a super hot cup of tea right before you're gonna vocalize and warm up, well, the heat from that tea could very easily create that mucal response in you and create problems. So take a look at the bigger picture, stay hydrated, and then maybe leave a comment in a couple weeks and let me know how it's all going, and maybe we can talk a bit more about it. Still pushing the wrong buttons. My question is about performance anxiety. How do I control anxiety for auditions? I've talked about this at length, but not recently. There are several videos. If I remember, I will put something on the screen in the cards so that you can have a look and maybe do a bit more of a deep dive. The short answer is to keep performing, but look at how you are approaching performance and look at how you are practicing not only in the preparations of the pieces that are going to be performed, but in your performance practice. And you may also want to consider how you might stage a practice to become more comfortable in performance anxiety-inducing situations. For example, let's say you are very comfortable vocalizing on a daily basis, and you are comfortable recording yourself for your own evaluation. What if you recorded 10 minutes of vocalizing that you then shared with a trusted friend, or if you work with a singing instructor, sharing it with them? If you're a member of my online community, the RVC, you could share it in the community, and then I could have a listen to it, as well as some other people could have a listen to it too. You have to find these little steps to move the ball downfield, in a manner of speaking, and move towards the performance that you are practicing this for. So if it's an audition, then you might start with those first few steps, and then you might go and perform a song for your trusted friend that you share the recording with, or family members, or you might go to an open mic. Or if you really want to up the ante, you could go and busk, which is perhaps one of the most adversarial performance practices you could possibly do. I wouldn't necessarily advise that, but you could do that. There are lots of different ways to challenge yourself to continue to perform and become more accustomed to the practice. The key here is to take small steps. So going from sharing a 10-minute vocalization with a friend to busking is probably not going to work out. You want to find little steps along the way. The difficulty is that you have to be an active participant in deciding those steps. So if you're working with a teacher or a coach or something to that effect, then have a discussion with them about how you might pace yourself in order to prepare for the audition goal that you have. It goes without saying, so I shall say it now, that having enough time is key. So if you're thinking about this and it's a week before the audition, it's quite likely too late. Ideally, if you struggle with performance anxiety significantly, then this can be a month's or a year's long process. For me, it took me several years before I felt like I could really perform at my peak, and in fact sometimes exceed my peak because of the energy that happens in live performance. Before that, it was a struggle, and it was a kind of embarrassingly well-known struggle that in the practice room and in the lesson I could be here, but when I stepped out on stage, it just really, really crumbled for me. So I feel for you. I hope this helps. I would encourage you to keep going. Find those small steps. Talk to your coach. And most of all, keep going. I'm pretty sure I'm a mezzo, though since I started singing again fairly recently, my secondo passaggio sits pretty low and I am more comfortable with your alto practices. I go with your mezzo-soprano practices most days, as my primary goals right now are smoothing my break, not tipping into head voice as fast as I usually do, and develop good tongue and larynx position. However, I also like to do your sing low notes exercises video for altos a few times a week. I use vocal fry for most of the video, as I can only sing down to C3, but I like hanging out down there and kind of hope it will strengthen my lower register. Not necessarily expand it, but make it sound fuller. My question is, do you think it could hurt my voice or short-term goals to do that? Thank you. Maybe. Singing with vocal fry isn't consistent with neutral tone production that you would, the neutral tone production that you would be creating throughout the remainder of your range. So you're using your voice in a different way in that register. It's not going to seamlessly connect upwards. And the danger there is in creating habits around vocalizing that way that will affect the way that you are using your voice in the rest of your range, where you're trying to smooth over the transitions in your voice. You mentioned starting to sing again fairly recently. I don't know how long of a time period you had off, nor do I know what you were doing before you took that time off. And I've never heard you either, so I don't really know all of what's going on. But all of these things can mean that there's some instability in the way that you're going to phonate. And by switching from vocal fry to a more neutral tone production in the rest of your range, it has the potential to confuse things a little bit. If you and I were working together, I would start with you in the middle, the most comfortable areas of your range, and then work outwards from there. It's also worth mentioning, too, that you talk about making the lower sound of your voice fuller. That's probably not going to happen with vocal fry. That's a fundamentally different way of configuring the vocal fold from, again, what we would be using in the more central area of your vocal range. And it's not going to resonate in the same way. It's not going to have the same kind of fullness. I would suggest that you would be better served by starting in the middle area of your voice, working on the registration events as you've mentioned doing, and gently moving down towards the lower notes that you might enjoy singing, and assess carefully as you go how you are performing those pitches. For me, by way of example, I'm never going to have the kind of rich baritone tone qualities that baritone vocalists have in such delightful quantities. So as I descend, me, 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 I'm going to get brighter as opposed to trying to become fuller. Me, 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 me. If I tried to push into that, to somehow develop gravitas, it wouldn't really work out for me very well. It would not sound right. I would have intonation problems. I would have problems then ascending back into the more central areas of my voice. So start in the middle, work outwards from there. Get back in touch after a few weeks or a month or so and let me know how it's all going. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for your questions. As always, I really appreciate it, and I do hope that this helps. My name's Jeff. Thank you if you've chosen to subscribe. If you haven't yet, now would be an awesome time. There are also, of course, other ways to support my channel. Those are in the description. And finally, they do include Patreon, where you can get MP3s and PDFs of these practices. Thank you one last time. Have a wonderful day. Take really good care of your voices. Enjoy singing. And hopefully, we'll see you again. Bye.